Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tego Bure, a graduate student intern with the University of Illinois Chicago's Right of Way as Habitat Working Group, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're very excited to kick off our Knowledge and Understanding Forum webinar series with an enriching exploration into traditional ecological knowledge and Indigenous approaches to right-of-way management. This series is a culmination of the successful Research Roundtable series we've hosted over the past 2 years, and we're very eager to take the next step in advancing our understanding of best practices for right-of-way land management. Throughout this webinar today, we will be privileged to hear case studies and success stories from Grow With Trees, Minnesota DOT, the Burns Paiute Tribe, and Jacobs. In this Knowledge and Understanding series, we delve into the impact of coordinated efforts with tribal partners and right-of-way managers, and explore the practices of cultural tending and place-based approaches using traditional ecological knowledge. Our main objectives for this webinar are to highlight the current groundwork related to traditional ecological knowledge, facilitate discussions about current and future underground TK work, and open up conversations that may lead to collaborative conservation work. We're committed to creating an interactive and collaborative environment during this webinar, so we encourage you to ask questions at the end of the presentations about traditional ecological knowledge and the various approaches to right-of-way management, which you will hear about from our respective speakers. Joined with me here is Caroline Hernandez, also with the University of Illinois Chicago, and we'd like to extend a special thanks to our co-host, Ashley Bennett at the Electric Power Research Institute, and Toby Chu at Southern Company, who supported the planning of this webinar. So just a few housekeeping items. As a reminder, please keep your mics muted and video off. During the Q&A session, we invite you to chat in questions if you have any questions. And if you can, could you please update your Zoom name to include your organization? And you can do this by hovering over your name and clicking the 3 dots in the top right corner. If you're having any technical difficulties, please feel free to reach out to Caroline Hernandez via the chat box. And for any questions or comments you might have for our speakers, we will have a Q&A session following the 3 research presentations, but you may also chat in your questions in at any time. We are recording today's session and we will share it in the Right of Way as Habitat Working Group afterwards. So I'd just like to extend a special thanks to our speakers today. We have Nikki Hill, who is a compatibility species specialist at Grow With Trees. We also have Calla Hagle with the Burns Paiute Tribe. We have Shannon Crosse with Jacobs, a senior biologist. Levi Brown, who's the director of tribal affairs at Minnesota DOT. We have Tina Markeson, who works with roadside vegetation at Minnesota DOT. And we also have Teresa Martin, who is a culture affairs specialist with the Minnesota Department of Transportation. So I'm going to kick us off now with Nikki Hill, who is going to talk to us about bringing land management to the table. And I will pass it on to Nikki. Thank you, Nikki.
Pardon me, it took me a minute to find the unmute button. My name is Nikki Hill, and I work with Grow With Trees. I am their compatible species specialist. Personally, I've been engaged in restoration, small-scale farming, and learning how to wild tend indigenous first foods of the Great Basin region for the past 18 years. Grow With Trees is a small consulting firm that works with utilities who are interested in fostering positive relationships with compatible plants within their right-of-ways. This involves changing the conversation from one of control to one of nurturing, where we're trying to encourage the stable plant community we want by inviting an understanding of the lands we're stewards for. We've been calling this inviting collaboration with the land to the management table. And we've been stating it this way because it's a perception change and asking people to consider their own connections to place in developing their management protocols, and also bringing awareness to long-standing Indigenous relationships to place in making sense of mutually beneficial management decisions. Uh-oh. Humans have been tending and interacting with and shaping their landscapes to sustain their lifeways for millennia. Indigenous cultures from around the world hold an evolving and adaptive knowledge of place that has been accumulated over generations of direct engagement. This kind of knowledge arises from an intimate dependence on and attentiveness to a place. It is an ecological perspective that also considers the human-environment relationships to a place. This cumulative knowledge is known as traditional environmental knowledge, or TEK for short. TEK is passed down orally through traditional stories, ceremonies, and songs. And it's intimately place-based, where the place has been the teacher, guiding people how to understand how they contend for the plants they rely on for food, medicine, shelter, fiber, hunting grounds, and other uses. It is both a practical understanding and a sacred understanding that comes from a deep connection with the land they're on, and again, a dependence on that land base. Translating the different perspectives is often missing from current management practices. A Western science approach is reductionist and focused on individual species, whereas a traditional ecological approach describes the individual aspects of an ecosystem within the context of the whole ecosystem. By bridging both of these perceptions, we have the potential to lend qualitative stories of place to quantitative databases. Both of these ways of looking are important for pattern recognition and tracking patterns of growth and response to the different activities that we do in the course of management. Both of them are based on observation, experience, and social interaction in order to build a cumulative knowledge base. The common ground with both of them is an inquisitiveness, open-mindedness, again, looking at pattern recognitions to understand what we're doing and how the land is responding. And another common ground is that both Western science and TEK are creating a stable knowledge base that can adapt to cycles and changes. We might know it better as adaptive management in the worlds we're in. With Grow With Trees, we've been working with a utility company called Liberty up in the Lake Tahoe Basin, the high Sierras of California, for the past 3 years. We've been bringing in plant identification trainings and also landscape awareness trainings. And a part of that focus that we've brought in has been a focus on culturally important plants. These are plants that are important to a subsistence-based culture. There are plants that support a lifeway and a direct relationship to the land. There are particular uses, significance, and ways of tending them that are specific to a place and to a culture. And one way I was coming up with relating the relationship to culturally important plants is, if we think of modern civilization, we don't consider our agricultural crops typically to be culturally important plants, but corn, soy, and wheat are important for a modern agricultural lifeway. So many of the indigenous cultures where we might be working with or seeking partnerships with did not have an agricultural lifeway, but they still had plants that they depended on in order to survive and thrive within a region. The basis for the way we've been approaching trying to bridge a Western science perspective and a traditional ecological understanding is by first coming to a place of observation, reading the landscape. This is important to understand the land you are working with in order to get a feel for what's going on and how it all relates. This will also give you a feel for how the plant communities and wildlife communities and water flow is responding to the different activities you may be doing in a place. Each site that you're working in will be unique in its relationship to the surrounding landscape, which definitely has an influence on responses there. And the reading the landscape is helpful in coming to understand these things over time. So understanding the different environmental communities or the plant niches that might be in the areas you're working with. It's helpful in understanding the interconnected aspects of the place and inhabitants, like what plants are needed for what wildlife, how they're using it, stuff like that. And reading the landscape is also telling you a story all of the time in the expression of the vegetation and the topography and the movement of water in a place. It's telling you a story of conditions as they are now. It's also telling you the stories of historical disturbances that can be seen in the vegetative expression now, as it is now. Examples of traditional ecological knowledge tending practices can be found in various places in the world, and some are being brought more into the forefront recently, which is pretty cool. Some practices involve cultural burning, which is the intentional setting of low intensity burns in order to promote certain plant communities. The oak savanna lands of California have been meticulously tended by fire in order to retain an open grassy-like setting for hunting grounds, to encourage an open oak tree canopy that produces larger nuts, and also to control acorn weevils who like to overwinter in the soil. So that's all providing for better harvest for the nuts. Propagation is layering, seeding, and cultivating, and this can refer to individual plants or patches of plants. Layering involves the anchoring or burying of lower branches to the soil, and where those branches are layered and anchored to the soil, they'll start to create more roots that can increase the patch spread of that patch of plants. Seeding is the intentional gathering and sowing of seeds into the proper niches for growth. This can be done with or without soil cultivation. Traditional digging sticks have been used to dig starchy roots from the ground. And a part of this action, this very localized small disturbance, is opening up the soil to receive seeds, water, and air. Pruning can also be looked at as regenerative cutting. So it's used to encourage a particular quality of regrowth of the mostly woody shrubs you'd be working with. Coppicing willows during dormant season has been used to encourage flexible, long, straight regrowth for use in weaving materials. And another interesting pruning example is the harvesting of pine nuts, the pinyon pines that grow in the West. A long, sturdy flail is used to hit the pine cones in the trees to retrieve the nuts. And a part of that bruising of the tissue at the branch tips actually encourages multiple cones to be produced at those sites in future years. So that kind of interaction from harvesting is a type of pruning that encourages more nuts later. So for the past 3 years, Grow with Trees and I have been working with Liberty in the Sierras in the Tahoe Basin. We've been endeavoring to create place-based protocols and providing awareness trainings in order to bridge the boots to the boardroom. We've come to realize that some of the environmental goals that are stated by the boardroom, such as biodiversity, sustainability, or habitat, are often not very well understood beyond a broad conceptual framework. So there needs to be some grounding of this understanding within a region so that it can make sense. Basically trying to bring the understanding back to the ground and develop the protocols from there, rather than having these very broad protocols and trying to make them fit where you are. As an example, the word biodiversity is becoming more and more popular in management objectives. But biodiversity is measuring the diversity of species in an area, but it's going to vary greatly from place to place and region to region. Like the high Sierras of California will never be reflecting the same amount of biodiversity as like the lush lowlands of the Appalachian Mountains, but it doesn't mean that that data isn't reflecting the biodiversity of that region. So trying to endeavor to bring that back to understanding what those numbers might be reflecting where you're at. It's hard to compare the two. So if our goal is to create protocols that make sense and are attainable where everybody is at, we have come up with some different things that keep arising that seem to be helpful in that process. The first one is curiosity. Curiosity is really important for directing and coming to find the right questions for what you're trying to accomplish. Like if we start with the right questions, we know how to develop a monitoring program to look at what we're interested in. Our curiosity also helps us understand who's around and what's possible. And it just helps us feel more connected to the places we're working with too, if we have a little space for just being curious and not just focused on how to do something before we have a little bit of that space. Another thing that comes up again with the word habitat kind of being this broad idea that gets repeated as if it's a completely set thing out there, is that habitats are actually a home, and it's helpful to remember that. So again, bringing it back to place and encouraging people to start to understand who is in their right-of-ways, who's using them, and how are they using them. And then directing some of our goals and objectives and ways of doing that from there by seeing what's already happening in the area. Habitat is also bigger than the right-of-way. The right-of-way zones are often narrow, and habitat is often a much larger thing than just a 30-foot zone. So it's important to start to understand how that right-of-way fits into the greater landscape for actual regional habitat provision. So that's where we come to wanting to know who's in your right-of-way, who's using it, and then looking at the surrounding landscape and coming to see what that's all about. Like, is it forested around you? Is it meadows? Is it steep slopes? How is that affecting what's happening where you are at the site you're at? And by having a consideration of the surrounding landscape, the goal is to start to become much more site specific in our prescription writing. Again, for success and for that collaboration, so that things can be pleasantly achieved, so that our goals can be pleasantly achieved. We need to understand how all of those things function together. I did want to mention about the habitat as home, is that another way in which it's home is that lots of wildlife have long-standing ancestral relationships to place as well. So starting to see how they're using your right-of-way now and teaching the next generations of wildlife how they're using it can be a really fun way of collaborating with with that lineage, that long lineage of the wildlife in that area as well, and supporting them. Another thing for fostering place-based protocols was coming up with creative monitoring programs. Again, curiosity helps us find the questions we want to answer, and the questions help us develop the monitoring program. It's hard to start one without the right questions first, knowing what you want to look at.
Hey, Nikki, just a minute left to go.
Oh, we're almost done already. Okay. So we were hoping to bring in qualitative aspects into the monitoring, such as photo monitoring for pictures and notes from the surveyors, so that people are coming to value our firsthand experiences of what's going on in the right-of-ways. And plant ID and awareness is getting to know who's who and how they relate to the people and the wildlife there. Now it's not moving. Okay. The importance of seeking partnerships, again, is to have the practical and sacred understanding of people who have been in place for a very long time, that long-term observation, that deep knowing. Historically, this understanding and tending has been fragmented and removed from the land, and that needs to be brought back to the forefront. And also seeking partnerships with different groups, tribal, conservation, and advocacy groups can help guide protocols and directives that are locally important for success. Yeah, there's quite a delay going on, I think. Some of this bridging of TEK and Western science and place-based priorities requires a change of mindset. Some challenges that have come up in conversations of managing for culturally important plants is the use of herbicides. Remembering that culturally important plants are not just a symbolic relationship to Indigenous peoples. It's a subsistence interactive sacred relationship. So if there's areas that are being sprayed, how safe would those plants be for harvest? So if you work with a utility who can set aside some areas that are herbicide free or is already herbicide free, it's a much better starting place towards translating reasons for focusing on culturally important plants. Again, human relations are key in TEK conservation efforts, and tribal use and access are also important social justice issues. Place-based priorities up in Tahoe, we were focusing on the bear. So we'll be working on bear buffers, which is food zones for the bears, hopefully out of town, so they have plenty of food before they come into town. Everybody loves their bears. They also scatter lots of trash. So we're endeavoring with Liberty to start planting and promoting bear buffers outside of town. Many bear foods are also culturally important plants, and bears are also a keystone species. So hopefully all of those things together will be mutually beneficial. Included some different resources. The first two are from the Utility Arborists Association. They're two documents Grow with Trees and I worked on. Managing compatible vegetation for targeted species and biodiversity, goes through different tending techniques, and scope of work guidance helps people build those into their protocols and prescription writings. I included a fish and wildlife traditional ecological knowledge application. There are some understandings of bridging, bringing that into the management conversation. And then the USDA had a list of culturally important plants of North America specific to species with tending protocols, both traditional and modern day. So those are useful for getting started on that focus. And yeah, that's it. I just want to say thank you so much for having me. And it's really inspiring to have everybody here, even considering bringing these conversations into the management world. And I look forward to learning from all of you along the way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikki, for that wonderful presentation and sharing your insight with us. We're now going to hear from the folks at Minnesota DOT. So we have Levi Brown, the Director of Tribal Affairs, Teresa Martin, the Tribal Affairs Cultural Resource Specialist, and Tina Markeson, the Roadside Vegetation Management Supervisor. So I will turn it over to you.
So I will kick us off. You did a great job, Tega, of introducing us all. On the screen here is all the tribes that exist in Minnesota. Let's see, currently, yeah. So these are some of the topics that we'll be covering. The names next to it are the names of the person that will be covering it. So Levi, oh, there you are. So you just went away from my screen, but I'm going to turn it over to Levi Brown to talk about the reservation and trust lands in Minnesota and give us a little bit of history on treaties.
Thanks, Tina. First off, just thank everybody for listening in and being part of this conversation. So a little intro, just so you get some context for my role within the state of Minnesota is, I work as the statutorily appointed kind of primary contact and decision maker for the Minnesota Department of Transportation within Indian country. And so what I mean by that Indian country is treaty areas, tribal trust lands, reservations, allotments, wherever Indian country might be defined. So one of the things that I think is most unique about Minnesota is that we have 11 tribal nations that have their government centers within Minnesota. 7 are Ojibwe, 4 Dakota, but they're all diverse. And out of those 11 tribes, some have international borders, some have urban interactive interfaces borders where they're right in the middle of an urban area. Some have large waterways, some have access to the Great Lakes, just a diverse demographic, geography that crosses our state. And what's even more unique is you see Ho-Chunk, which is a tribal nation that their headquarters are in Wisconsin, but their historical territory is part of Minnesota, from which they still have tribal trust land, which is Indian country, which again is where we would work and consult directly with Ho-Chunk on many different fronts. So just wanted to share this kind of geography with folks so you get to understand the context for why we work the way we do, why the state of Minnesota interacts with tribal nations the way they do. And the other thing too is you can't really see it here, but in context is there are 3 reservations that are larger than the state of Rhode Island located within Minnesota. Leech Lake, Red Lake, and White Earth. I can see she's putting the pointer there. And I think that that's real unique when you think about our relationship because fresh water in Minnesota, about 10% of it is on Leech Lake at any given moment. And another 10% is on Red Lake at any given moment in time. There's a large amount of fresh water that is not exclusively regulated by the state of Minnesota. But with that said, maybe we'll go into talking a little bit about treaties and how that impacts our governance and how we choose to kind of relate to each other. Next slide. So one of the things that I think is really critical when we're having this conversation about treaties and tribes and our working alongside of each other in partnership and collaboration is often folks interpret treaties as somehow the tribes were gifted something or given something in a treaty, when in reality, what treaties were land cessions. The vast majority of treaties in the United States, specifically in Minnesota, were land cession treaties. You see the map to the right, those are all different treaty boundaries. Every one of those different colorations there is a different treaty. And so when I work with state staff and we ask the question of, how much of Minnesota was ceded in treaties with tribal nations, the answer is everything but the reservations that are maintained or Indian country or other tribal trust lands. And I think that that's when we think about myself, like I'm a state employee, but I'm a citizen of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe in north central Minnesota, is there are treaty people and everybody's a treaty person. If you live in Minnesota and you live in land that was ceded through a tribal treaty, you got a benefit of that treaty. And oftentimes in my state, people often think, oh, the tribes have treaty rights to hunt, fish, and gather. They were given those rights. No, they were reserved. They've always had them. They're inherently theirs. It's recognized in the US Constitution. The Supreme Court has recognized them. And so it's kind of one of those things where we in Minnesota try to teach and have conversations about the reality of what a treaty means and what it doesn't mean, right? That tribes gave up land in those treaties, but they reserved everything else, including self-governance, self-regulation, and their access to those resources. So one of the things you see at the bottom is complex jurisdictional situations. That is why we at MnDOT focus so hard on partnerships, because a lot of times you don't know what the courts will say, you don't know, what different attorneys might say. But at the end of the day, if you ask the tribe what's important and a priority to them, a lot of times it lines up with the mission of our, environmental office, our natural resources departments. A lot of times the missions matches up with what the tribe wants. And so sometimes we can work right through our partnerships and our statutory requirements to consult and coordinate. We work through those processes and get us to the outcome we're looking for, that both the tribal nation and the state of Minnesota are looking to succeed. And one thing about this, I know there's a question and answer at the end, but if you've got questions about some of this conversation points and how it works between a state government and tribal government, please put them down. I mean, I think wouldn't be very fruitful if you don't have a chance to have those questions. So next slide. One of the things that is often kind of, I don't know what you want to say, people want to be able to kind of have conversations about is how do you have a government to government relationship, and how does that look, and what is the end game? What is the end point of having a government to government relationship? So for Minnesota, we have a state statute now, 1065, that outlines a requirement for state agencies to consult with tribes. It doesn't say what the end game is, the end goal, but the end goal is that it's a recognition of tribal sovereignty. It's a recognition that, tribal nations are decision makers, and so is the state of Minnesota, and that we must work together to achieve, a mutual beneficial outcome. And I think what's really unique in the state for us is that we don't just focus so much on the law, right? That we have a written law there, but we also, within that law, focus on the training aspect, the cultural exchange, the importance of, having understanding of each other's governments, teaching about each other's governments. Because in my line of work, the most dangerous thing you can have is assumptions. You can have assumptions between two governments, misunderstandings, which a lot of times are stemmed in cultural misunderstandings. And Teresa and Tina are both going to talk about some of the cultural impacts in the work we do, and also the importance of getting the worldview and sharing worldview of both, whether it's Ojibwe or Dakota culture, all those matter. And that kind of goes to the face-to-face versus virtual. I mean, you see me sitting in my car right now is because I'm on the road. I actually was just visiting with tribal officials, and the first 10 minutes of it was a very serious conversation. And the last 20 minutes was about, whose reservation basketball team is going to beat who this year, and a cup of coffee, and that humanization of that conversation, that seeing each other as human beings, really truly does matter when you have 200 plus years of a clouded past. For Minnesota, it's 150 plus years of maybe not always seeing eye to eye. And that's even why, it's more important to coordinate, making sure that, you're transparent in your conversations. If every detail matters when you have years of mistrust, right? You have to be just honest and upfront. And you can't measure whether a tribe's going to react to what you say or not. You just have to tell them and have that conversation. That's the respectful thing of government to government, is you see each other as human beings. You're not, treating tribal nations as though, their relationship with the federal government, which has been pretty paternal in nature, meaning that the tribes have, been treated wards of the state. And when you close it all up and you wrap it all up, as Teresa and Tina do this quite a bit for their work, and it's actually per our tribal nations policy at MnDOT, it's a mandate and a responsibility of all employees to communicate to the hills, to make sure that at the right levels conversations are happening, whether it's cultural resource, environmental, whatever it might be, or the commissioner talking to the tribal chair, whatever that proper line is, that those folks are talking and that we are having a conversation. Because without those interactions, those communications, assumptions are made, voids are filled with narratives that are not ours, or maybe not even the tribe's intentions. And so I just cannot stress that enough, is reach out as much as possible and truly take time to listen to what each other have to say. I don't think I have any more slides, but I will pause and let Tina and Teresa take over. Thank you.
There we go. Okay. Thank you, Levi. Hits the nail on the head when he talks about communication. And one thing I wanted to mention is that those pieces of information can come in under consultation. They can come in from other parts of your organization that are doing work with the tribe, and different. It may not be on vegetation. It might be on some other matter. And I bring that to light because when assessing impacts on projects to cultural resources in our right of way, or if it's an expanded, MnDOT project outside of the right of way, we determine effects to cultural resources, which is a NEPA term and generally refers to archaeological resources or architectural resources, but it can also mean landscapes. And for tribes, cultural resources are also plant communities. We're talking wild rice, we're talking places where people are tapping trees for maple syrup, we're talking hunting and gathering areas during what particular seasons. So that when you are gathering information about potential impacts that might be important to the tribes on the vegetation, be sure to reach out to other members of your institution that may be having meetings with tribes on subjects that you might not loop in the vegetation, because it very well could. Vegetation or eco-habitats, or as Nikki Hill really succinctly put it, as habitats are home. So it's their home. I can talk about a couple of examples, depending on our time. I'll start with one. One of the examples I was going to bring up is we were doing some work on the White Earth Nation within the reservation boundaries. This is one of the big three that Levi was referring to. We were widening shoulders to accommodate pedestrians and bicycles and improving some intersections. And in the course of our conversations with the White Earth DNR and with our Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, it became apparent that there were plants that were of importance to the tribe that were not, say, on our typical list of threatened and endangered species that we might do a plant survey on. And this information was shared with the MnDOT folks who are doing the plant survey, so that, and Tina, I think you were involved in this. So one of the things we did, in addition to looking for impacts to threatened and endangered species, we're also this list of tribally important plants. For instance, one of them, and you can see it on the slide here, is the lady slipper, which is a culturally important plant to many Anishinaabe groups. It's used in arts and design and in stories. And so this is one of the plants that we identified and moved outside of the right of way to protect them, and so that they could flourish outside of the right of way where the construction was going to happen. Another example of work that we were doing up in the same area, we were clearing trees for the clear zone, then also doing selective tree clearing for, what do you call it again?
Road shading.
Road shading. We didn't consult with the tribe nearest to there, because it wasn't within their reservation, our mistake, it was within some of the ceded territory lands that the tribe still used during the season, and they were pretty upset that we hadn't consulted with them. And so we re-engaged, and we were able to go out and do a plant survey with them. In particular, they were interested in cedar trees and some of the eco zones for our eco areas systems for the lady slipper and others. But remember to know your treaties. And it's important because those lands are still used, as Levi was touching on those treaty rights. The tribe may have ceded some land base, but they didn't cede any of their inherent rights to these properties. So those are just a couple of the examples. Is reach out. You may not be getting just that information of what plants and ecosystems are important just from, say, their DNR. They may come from their cultural folks as well. I'm going to turn it over now, back over to Tina.
So as Nikki, Levi, and Teresa have already said, those gathered resources, they have a lot of purposes and they have many, many uses. And throughout, my career and just going and talking and learning from the Indigenous people, the plants, land, the environment is really part of part of who a person is and how they view themselves in the world. And so it's a very, in the white culture, we think of this as well. I mean, if you really think about it, if you're really super stressed out, if you need to visit a place to visit, to meditate, or to feel the presence of a loved one, where do you go? And how would you feel if that all of a sudden went away and you didn't have any say about that? So kind of putting yourself in their shoes a little bit and understanding that taking away a piece of their world kind of leaves them unbalanced. And not a lot of us like that feeling of being unbalanced. So just kind of understanding that. One of the important things that we've learned as well is that cultural importance can include native and non-native plants. We've come across some plants that are not native to Minnesota, but they've been naturalized so long here in the state that the different communities have figured out a way to use them, whether it's medicinal or through artistry or representation in their culture. And so just because it's not native doesn't mean that the plant is not native, doesn't mean that it still doesn't have some type of importance to the tribal members. So it's really important, like that slide said, to communicate and fully understand what those needs are. Another thing, and this gets back to the TEK as well, and understanding Western science versus TEK, plants don't always grow where we anticipate them to grow, especially in the built environment. The picture on the screen here of sweetgrass it's a picture on Minnesota's roadside. We didn't know it existed there because that's not where we would anticipate finding sweetgrass. It's growing there. And, we did some maintenance in this area and the tribe reached out and was like, well, you're mowing all the sweetgrass down. So, having those conversations, understanding that the people on the land really do know the land, and they want to work together with those who are doing the maintenance of the land as well. So another thing about these built corridors, whether they be utility or road, is that they can increase the amount of access that people have to different plant communities. And so I bring that up more as a discussion point, and talking with the tribe and the tribal members and finding out, did we open up an area that's going to increase the amount of people visiting the site because it's now more accessible? And then asking the question as to whether or not it's safe, and going after the safety aspect and just trying to make sure that people understand the need to access that site and how do we go about doing that. And doing that as part of the project development phase as well. So did you have anything to add?
I was just going to add, in addition to, thank you, Tina, in addition to that is the timing of projects as well. if there are seasons in which people are tending to harvest plants on off the reservation or hunting and fishing that may involve access to those spots via the right of way, be sure to keep those things in mind as well, so that your project isn't preventing folks from, let's say, accessing a stream where they may want to be doing some fishing during a particular time of the year, or harvesting plants where, if it's in the right of way or adjacent to the right of way, if your work might be impacting those plants and in their and in the time of year when people are collecting those plants. The timing of projects is important in that respect as well.
So a couple of things here at MnDOT. Levi, if you're still on, we're getting 5-minute warning here. Do you want to talk quickly about our organization here in Minnesota real quick?
The state to state and government to government relationship.
Yeah, thanks. So I kind of alluded to it earlier about, the state statute, that 1065, that lines out how, state agencies and state government will interact and work government to government with tribal nations. And that law also kind of, it gives you the base framework for, that relationship, but it's up to each individual institution or each agency to decide how they will implement. And I think what's unique about the way MnDOT has done it is, the office I oversee, the Office of Tribal Affairs, the way it's structured and located within the agency is, I report to our Commissioner of Transportation, who has a direct role in communication line relationship with tribal leaders. That's kind of makes us different from maybe some other agencies where there's a little bit of a separation there, or maybe not that direct communication. But I think what's most unique about MnDOT is that we also house our tribal state leadership training that we, have, and we basically present to all state employees or make it accessible to all state employees. And I think that again comes back to capacity building. If you don't train your staff, your agency staff, you cannot expect them to have, to be successful when working with tribal nations, because you have to give them the capacity and the tools to go out and do this work, to have that understanding of why treaties are, why tribal nations don't always open up and are suspect of outside parties. I think, I've watched state staff who've taken the training go out with a whole new lens of how they deliver their work and do their work after they've taken the training versus prior to them taking the training. They just weren't able to understand why a tribe might have a reaction that they're having, or there being, mistrust there. And I think that's what makes us different with our agency. And then again, statewide enterprise. So I will pause.
You want to talk about how we do stuff in MnDOT?
Well, we have the Office of Tribal Affairs, and we also have our Office of Environmental Stewardship, of which Tina is part of, and includes our Cultural Resources Unit. Oftentimes we're called and asked about sharing information that we've worked on when working with tribes, and we work through agreements and such. And I just caution folks it's always good to share, but be careful about what you share, because your consultation efforts with tribes and understanding what's important to them is that consultation with your organization. It doesn't mean that information that they're happy to be sharing it with anyone else. It depends on who is asking and what information that they want. So just please keep that in mind too when sharing information, that some of that information is protected, or it's just for your organization, and it's not. You can't take someone else's consultation efforts and just slide them into your own organization. You develop those relationships and those sort of guidance rules on your own. You should be developing them on your own. Tribal Affairs has a really robust website. Can you switch the?
Well, I have one more slide before we get to resources.
Okay, all right. Well, I will let Tina go first, and then we'll wrap up with some additional resources. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
So one of the things that's specifically for vegetation and agreements and coordination with tribes. MnDOT has a couple of different things, different documents, procedures that we have when we start talking to tribes about vegetation. One of them is more formal, that's the Memorandum of Understanding. And then we have an informal document, and that's the 2-page one that you see there, that's the environmental context and procedures. And we have a discussion with each tribe and we ask them which one would work better for them. It's really, you know, what best fits your wants, your needs. And maybe the answer is neither, you know, and that's fine too. These are just two areas where two tools that we're able to use. And so everybody has something to refer to and everybody's on the same page. As the documents need updating, it provides a great opportunity for us to meet face to face and learn about maybe something else that the tribe has been thinking about. And so one of the things that came out of the meeting there, pictured on for the Memorandum of Understanding, is that the Grand Portage tribe determined that our seed mixes weren't as great as they would have liked to see. So we went back and we said, okay, this is the seed mix we think we're going to be putting in. What are we missing? What don't you want to see on this? And so through this, we've developed a seed mix specific for Grand Portage for construction purposes. And that's been a great tool for us because it gets more of that vegetation out onto the land. We're running out of time, so we won't go through these resources, but as Teresa mentioned, we've got some great tribal resources on our website. That top one there will get you to a lunch and learn list of videos that are all available on YouTube. One of them that is of interest especially is one by Katie Ferris. It's actually written out as Cade, K-A-D-E. But his presentation on presenting on tribal GIS databases also includes some really great information about TEK and just vegetation knowledge and that kind of thing as well. So that one is one of them that's on there that I would highly recommend listening to. It's got some great information on there. With that though, there's some other resources, and I think Tega and Caroline, you are going to make this available afterwards, so everybody will have access to that. But that's the end. Levi, do you have any parting comments before we turn it over?
No, I just saw a comment in the chat. I think my contact info is there, and Teresa and Tina have ability to share that info with anybody that would like to further discussions or have questions. Thanks.
Yeah,
Yep.
feel free to reach out. We'll get you to the right people if that's Levi. And yep, thank you. Thank you for inviting us to be a part of this. It's great, and we've learned a lot as well. So thank you.
All right, Tega, you got it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Minnesota DOT.
And Tega, we'll post this webinar on our website when it's ready to go.
Wonderful.
As well.
Thank you so much. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yes, that was a very informative presentation. So thank you so much. And for the resources that were shared earlier, Caroline has made that available in the chat. Oh, I can't control my own screen. There we go. So to wrap up our presentations, we're now going to hear from Calla Hagle, who is the Natural Resources Director at Burns Paiute Tribe, and Shannon Crosse, a Senior Biologist at Jacobs. So I'm going to turn it over to both of you right now.
Thank you.
All right, it's working.
For the introductions. There we go. So I'll start out with some of the same information that Nikki, Levi, Teresa, and Tina covered so very well in describing TEK, or Indigenous Ecological Knowledge, as it's sometimes called as well. I guess I'll also start out by mentioning that there has been some concern that the term traditional evokes a sense that this knowledge is from the past only. And that is not the case here. Though this knowledge has been developed over millennia, it's very much a current cultural, social, and environmental practice today. Indigenous or traditional ecological knowledge refers to an understanding of ecosystems acquired through long-term observations by people living in close relationship with their environment. The Burns Paiute tribe, and to my knowledge, many others, consider this relationship to be reciprocal and familial, People are a part of their environment. They do not stand apart, but within the systems, and they're related to the fish and wildlife that inhabit those systems. So often TEK intersects with tribal sovereignty and the federal and state trust responsibilities and relationships that can be cultivated under those law, policies, and interests. And lastly, I just mentioned that TEK is often regionally tied and at times specific to tribes, clans, or families. And often there are similar threads that weave TEK holders together, but because it's unique to each, it's so important to learn from the Indigenous people that live in your region. Next slide, please. So from the mid-2000s to today, there's been this gradual recognition and incorporation of TEK within individual land management agencies. And that all starts with our ability to understand that tribal cultural practices are relevant. So something that tribes live today, and that they are important because they're an important form of knowledge and a science that needs to inform how we practice our land management responsibilities for them and for others. However, until last year, this integration was slow because it was not guided by comprehensive federal policy. In 2021, the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation recommended that the National Historic Preservation Act revisions include TEK, and a request from the Council on Native American Affairs and the National Congress of American Indians asked the Biden administration to increase recognition of TEK. So in 2022, the first formalized Indigenous knowledge guidance for federal agencies was introduced. So now we're in a phase of applying this guidance and policy to create programs and agreements that support the relationships that are necessary to integrate TEK effectively, and of course, uphold the protection of sovereign treaty and inherent rights. And now we're going to move to Shannon to discuss how this intersects with diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you. Yeah, so I wanted to just kind of take a moment to sort of overlay these concepts. I think diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, is something that's been a big buzz acronym, and it's a lot of people are learning about this and implementing it. So this is sort of language we, I think, generally understand, but it dovetails really nicely with some of the concepts that we want to share today, and that we want to sort of plant some seeds about how we can integrate this and do a better job. And so I think a lot of this stuff has already been talked about in the previous talks, but the idea here is that we want to have a wide variety, a diverse group of voices at the table. And this includes tribes, and that there's equity among all of these voices, and that everyone has a seat at the table, whether they're a project opponent or an opponent, or whether there's challenges, that all can make a project better. And so if we're inclusive, this has a lot of benefits. We're going to identify conflict early by having open and early communication, foster education and collaboration, cultivating trust. We've talked a lot about that today. That's really important. But also it supports innovation and pragmatic solutions, and solutions that really reflect the communities that we are working in, and that includes tribal communities as well. So just wanted to plant that seed, and this can be kind of a fun thought experiment to ponder.
So yeah, just to expand on what Shannon just discussed, I think we just posed the question, what should be considered when developing projects or making decisions? I think there are many case studies and examples of projects that did not account for human concerns, and those were often met with resistance. They may have also been neglectful in their application, and therefore they failed, or sometimes even worse, they negatively impacted communities. And that does continue to occur most often in communities that have been underrepresented in the past. Scientific ecological knowledge, often referred to as Western science, and traditional ecological knowledge are often complementary. Not always, but still they should be used in tandem and equally to help ensure that planning, design, and development be envisioned more fully, and through both of those equally important lenses. Without a prior relationship with groups that are knowledge holders, it can be difficult to fully integrate TEK into project design. So one way of seeing knowledge holders is a person with an advanced degree who also bases many of their ethics, cultural practices, and ways of living on that knowledge. and they're often asked to share their perspectives without compensation. I think that they would be more willing to share their knowledge with those that have done the work to gain more basic understandings, to those who express a consistent interest. And that means early relationship building and consistent collaborative work as projects evolve. When the definitions of the National Historic Preservation Act are interpreted narrowly to just include archaeological resources and consultation is limited to those, a greater perspective is lost. So however, as new guidance has been provided by the administration at the highest levels, I think a better definition of the scope of concerns covered by trust responsibilities is now provided and can be integrated into consultation. So now Shannon is going to introduce the first case study, which is a wildlife passage project that the Burns Paiute tribe has led.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so we're going to kind of switch gears here and talk about some work that Calla and I worked on together over the years. And it's a project regarding wildlife vehicle collisions on Highway 20 in Eastern Oregon. And, at first glance, a lot of people might not see that wildlife vehicle collisions have sort of a TEK or tribal connection. But we're going to kind of walk you through this case study and hopefully show you that in a compelling way that, in fact, this is a really important tribal resource and topic. So I'm going to set the stage here. We're in Eastern Oregon in Harney and Malheur counties. We've got Highway 20, running east-west through the state. It has some of the highest densities of wildlife vehicle collisions in the state, and it has the highest densities of mule deer vehicle collisions in those counties. So the gray line that you see kind of traversing the landscape is Highway 20, and the darker spots are areas of higher animal-related crashes and wildlife vehicle collisions, and many of those are mule deer. So I'm going to dive in a little bit more into some of the data. We did a deep dive looking at the status of what's going on out in this landscape, and we found a overwhelming number of mule deer vehicle collisions. Many other species are impacted, but mule deer are particularly impacted. And we are, estimates are that at least $60 million in property damage, human injuries, and human fatalities, as well as wildlife mortality, have accumulated since 2007, just on this small stretch of highway in this area. So this is a pretty big, significant level of mortality and a really significant societal safety issue. And it's the highway is fragmenting habitat. It's also causing a barrier for species, and it's bisecting really important resources, water and food that a wide variety of species need. It's also located in very important winter range for a variety of ungulates, including mule deer and elk and pronghorn and other species. So this is a pretty important ecological issue. This is a really important societal and road safety issue. But we're going to walk you through why it is also a really important tribal issue as well. So we're going to dive into that.
Yeah, so just give a little bit more background on the Burns Paiute. They're known as the Wada-tika in the Northern Paiute language. And wada is a plant that produces a high protein seed, and tika means to eat. And they've lived on this vast traditional homeland that includes central and southeastern Oregon, northern Nevada, northwestern California, and western Idaho. Their original reservation included all of the Malheur Basin, which is a very culturally important place for the tribe. But shortly after signing the treaty with the federal government, they canceled the treaty to make way for agriculture and mining development within those lands. Today, the tribe has an incredibly small fraction of their original homelands and reservation, but they do hold the title to a wildlife mitigation site along Highway 20. And so over time, the traffic on this roadway has increased. And it's become very apparent that the deer that winter there are in stark decline. For a few different reasons, but we do believe that one of those reasons is a very high level of mortality on the roadway, as it's one of the worst deer vehicle collision hotspots in Oregon. So the tribe received funding from BIA and the Paiute Tribal Trust to conduct a feasibility study to identify how to begin addressing the issues and how to conduct and also to conduct stakeholder workshops to ensure that we were including the voices of the people that live and work in the area. Next slide, please. So we've returned to the slide that Shannon used to describe the scientific ecological knowledge perspective that was important to this project. And now I'll describe how we can use two-eyed seeing, or a way of looking through the lens of Western science with one eye and Indigenous knowledge with the other. So we start off with the $60 million price tag associated with these wildlife vehicle collisions over time. And we can use these numbers, which are striking, to make a case that addressing wildlife collisions is worth it. But I also want to make the point that for Indigenous communities, as well as just communities in rural areas, there are often these deep cultural ties to the environment and the animals. And these are often communities with limited incomes. And so when these factors come together, trying to simply assign a dollar figure to an animal or its carcass really does not represent the full impact for people who are reliant on those animals to feed their families, their communities, and their cultures. And these effects just undervalue those numbers that we use to do cost-benefit analyses. And the fact is that these problems have a disproportionate impact on tribal and rural communities. And the second is motorist safety. Because of the location of this issue on Highway 20 near tribal lands, tribal members have a higher exposure to risks of deer vehicle collisions. For habitat fragmentation, this is in nature of TEK, an understanding of preserving the integrity of ecological systems and processes that directly relate to seasonal rounds. And seasonal rounds are patterns of moving from one location to another to hunt and gather foods and medicines. And so if the deer are prevented from a natural pattern of movement, this in turn affects the people that are reliant on those deer and the whole system that reflects those relationships. For winter range, this area has very deep cultural history, and families have passed down that knowledge through generations. And as it becomes more interrupted and deer populations near the brink, these connections and cultural ties are also degraded. So concerns may be more understood, and therefore addressing those concerns becomes more likely. And this is reflected in the next part of this presentation, where Shannon will describe the process that she developed for Highway 20 Wildlife Crossing Project.
Very cool. I love that's really neat. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much time here, but I want to show you guys a little bit about how we sort of integrated some of these concepts into the project that we worked on together. We were going out and doing a sort of pretty standard wildlife connectivity assessment from that kind of standard scientific ecological point of view, but we wanted to integrate sort of DEI and TEK and these different threads into the project. So we sort of structured things a little differently. So in addition to doing our typical data collection and scientific analyses and recommendations and feasibility investigations for wildlife vehicle collision mitigation, we also led a series of workshops that were sort of built in tandem to the report building, which allowed us to grab a wide variety of stakeholders and agencies from the local, state to the federal level, including the tribe, and got people together to sort of hive mind this project. We created a shared vision statement so we could really make sure all voices were captured and heard, and we could build consensus and start building interest into the project. And we worked with everybody to educate them and develop feasibility and sort of integrated that into the report as the workshops were going. So that was a really neat approach. I'm going to talk just really briefly about some of the activities that we did and why they were important. But the main theme here is that we were inclusive and diverse, and everyone had a seat at the table. And the end result really did truly reflect everyone's voice, concern, and their values. So we had a series of activities at each workshop that were really aimed at educating the group of people that attended the workshop so that we could all kind of be on the same page. But we also had active activities that allowed them to sort of use that knowledge, but also integrate their voice and their perspective. And then that information was used in the final report to identify project prioritization and sort of map out action planning. So there was some teeth behind it, and it sort of helped us sketch out where we were going. And we knew that we had sort of consensus and that we had worked out kinks and identified conflict throughout. So that was a really great sort of approach. And what we ended up with was a large group of people that were burgeoning experts in these issues and that were educated and are already kind of, you know, gotten into it. And they are continuing on this work. And Calla is going to talk a little bit about those ongoing efforts and sort of the value that has been added to those.
Yeah, so the tribe does continue to lead a coalition of stakeholders, and we're building that coalition with continued community engagement. In September of last year, we hosted the Oregon Wildlife Migration and Safe Passage Summit. We had many speakers that shared current information and opportunities in wildlife passage, both nationally, in the state, and at the local level. We did a site visit to the Highway 20 area, and on the last day of the summit, there was a really great sense of enthusiasm and energy to dig in and collaborate on solutions for Highway 20 and other wildlife crossing projects throughout the state. We really feel that our early engagement with stakeholders and striving to be inclusive of all voices helped to increase this level of interest and commitment to the project, which we expect will help carry us through to long-term success in implementing wildlife passage measures in this area. So now Shannon will discuss a second, just a general case study where adherence to timing of minimum stakeholder engagement requirements may prevent a project from meeting its full potential.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're going to switch gears to another kind of common highway issue that we run into, which are fish passage barriers. Most states deal with these, and there are some opportunities here to integrate TEK into these projects. Many states are doing a really great job at coordinating early with tribes, but there's some things to look out for and some pitfalls that can be avoided. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So when we're replacing a perched or undersized culvert to be more passable for fish, we often are just thinking about the fish, and frankly, we're often just thinking about salmonids here on the West Coast and other parts of the country. And so I definitely challenge everybody to broaden your view, see the forest, not the trees, and think about more of a holistic ecological system and processes. We have some great pictures here of, deer barely making it through a crossing that was not designed for terrestrial species. And so what happens at a lot of these is when they're undersized or not designed for a wide variety of species, the animals will often either not be able to get through and you'll have a barrier, or they'll continue to cross over the top of the road and get hit. And we have mortality accumulating, and that presents a human safety concern as well, as we discussed earlier. So there's incentive to be thinking bigger, right? And thinking more holistically. But many tribes have a stake in this as well. And so some pitfalls to avoid are, number one, make sure that you're engaging with tribes very early on in the very early planning stages, not the environmental document stage. That's too late, but very early on, so that we can make sure that project initiation documents include all the cost estimates and design needed to have a more fully functional crossing that meets the needs of the local tribes and the local community, as well as the ecological community. So that's one thing to look out for. Another thing that's interesting is that, especially for ungulates that move around and migrate, we have subherds and herds and game management units. These animals can sometimes span jurisdictions across multiple tribes. And so the location of your project might be more close to one tribe, but the resource might, like deer, mule deer, for instance, might be a resource that multiple tribes have a stake in and an interest in. And we need to make sure that we're consulting with tribes even further away outside of our projects to make sure that those interests are met and integrated, and that we have had some pitfalls where certain tribes have not been consulted on these projects and they would have wanted to see more terrestrial wildlife integration into fish passage. And sometimes it's too late by the time those tribes connect with the DOTs. So, think holistically, but also don't be afraid to think a little bit outside of your geography where your project is. It never hurts to make sure that you're being inclusive at the start, because oftentimes when it's too late, and it becomes a lot harder to fix things once we're in that design phase or have implemented the project already. And we don't want to see lost opportunities for wildlife. The lifespan of this infrastructure is 75 plus years. And so we often have one really good shot at getting it right. And integrating TEK into our projects early on can actually give us that ecological uplift and ecological connectivity as well. So I hope I'm planting some seeds that get some juices flowing for you guys. And, just don't be afraid to think outside the box, if you will, on some of these projects. All right, we're going to start wrapping it up and talking a little bit about best practices and benefits. I'm going to pass it back to Calla.
Yeah, so this is our summary slide. So we posed the question, what would we recommend as best practices for land managers and other decision makers? And I think you've heard this echoed through all three presentations. Engage local stakeholders early and often. Center those relationships as being fundamental to success in all of your work in the public realm. And then I will also note, when it comes to information shared from tribes, there's often an obligation to protect some of that information. So find ways to be respectful and build that trust. So, as a whole, we can open and shift our mindset to become two-eyed seers, and understand that too many people, traditional practices are self-evident today, and social environmental systems are intertwined. So you may ask yourself, what are the benefits to including these perspectives? Well, firstly, I would say that there are many examples of where the inclusion of TEK has better informed management, and where listening to Indigenous perspectives has increased the awareness for problems before they become irreversible. And probably additionally very important in the face of climate change to be thinking about these holistic perspectives and ecosystems. Additionally, I'll also just plug that tribal nations often have staff, and where time and priorities align, those staff can often be helpful in creating products, reviewing plans, finding additional resources even, and assisting in ensuring that those projects and plans acknowledge both the sovereign as well as the local perspectives. And this often leads to better long-term outcomes, including building relationships that advocate for better social justice for historically underserved people. So in closing, I think we'll just, we want to plug that as individuals, we can shift our mindsets. So start where you are, ask questions, gain knowledge, keep growing. And if you are able to, advocate for better inclusion of TEK in your organization.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
And thank you very much for listening. Don't hesitate to contact Shannon or myself if you have any follow-up questions after today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Calla and Shannon. We deeply appreciated your DEI framework and your interesting case studies. Okay, and to all our presenters, we just want to thank you so much again for sharing your expertise. And I'm now going to turn it over to Ashley Bennett with the Electric Power Research Institute, who will lead us through our Q&A session.
All right, well, those were 3 great presentations. Again, thanks to the speakers. Basically, I wanted to open it up and see, for those of you that are still with us, if you have questions, you can take yourself off mute. You can type your question into the chat. If all of our speakers want to come back online, turn their cameras on so people can direct their questions at you, I think that would be great. And maybe while we're waiting, I will start with Shannon and ask you about your mule deer example. Through your different workshops and conferences, what were some of the solutions that you guys came up with to reduce mule deer mortality, and when do you anticipate starting to get to implement some of those solutions?
So I'll take the first part of that, and then Calla can probably take the back part. So as part of our wildlife connectivity assessment, the report that we did, we basically created what we called a toolbox, right? It's a connectivity and wildlife vehicle collision reduction toolbox. And it's all the various tools that we have within the state of the science to implement in a landscape. And then we went through sort of educating our workshop participants and what are all of these tools, how well do they work, because they're not all equal. And then did some activities around that to make sure we really got everybody on the same page, and then selected which ones we thought were feasible in the landscape. And then of those, prioritized several of them, which the top 3 were retrofitting existing infrastructure to make it more permeable for wildlife, and then new wildlife crossings. Now, there are other tools, and you can look to the report to see our full deep dive of each one, but Calla can talk a little bit about which ones are actually getting worked on being implemented as we speak.
Yeah, and I think I'll like harken back to like we're in the program development and agreement stage right now for some of these wildlife crossing measures, and we've done a little bit more refinement on these ideas in terms of where they need to be cited and some of the design aspects that need to be included. And so most recently, we have a report from the Western Transportation Institute that is sort of helping us move along towards an implementation plan. And so we're getting very close, and we do have funding available now to actually conduct a lot of those initial steps, those phase steps to getting this project implemented, at least in part in some of the highest priority areas that we've identified through Shannon's work. So we're on that cusp of implementation, and it's exciting.
Calla, can people email you for a copy of the report?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So that was a question in the chat. All right, so email Calla, it'll be in the slides.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, okay. I'm going to keep asking questions if people don't type their questions. So Teresa and Tina, I had a question for you guys. So I think a lot at EPRI with the utility companies I work with on seed mixes and designing seed mixes. So I was really curious. You mentioned that you guys had developed a seed mix, and then you worked with your tribe to kind of rework or modify that seed mix. And I was just curious what sort of modifications you needed to that seed mix after working with the tribes, and what that final seed mix looked like.
So the seed mix was one of our standard seed mixes that we put into or onto our roadside. And so we just made that available to the tribe and said, are there species here that you don't want? Are there species here that are missing that you would like? And so Grand Portage tribe came back to us and said we would like sweetgrass added to the mix. So we went and added sweetgrass. We later found out that we couldn't find enough seed, and so we had to modify our planting where we actually ended up buying plugs and putting plugs in instead of seed. Another species that they wanted that was missing out of our seed mix was Monarda. And so that was a really easy one to put in. So we put Monarda in. There wasn't any species that they said they did not want. So we kept our base seed mix the same. We just added those 2 species in.
Do you know the cultural significance of either the sweetgrass or the Monarda?
So
I know for bees, so I study bees. Monarda is great for pollinators.
The sweetgrass, that's an easy one. That is a very cultural plant. It has multiple uses in Grand Portage tribe. A lot of it has to do with smudging. So they braid it and then burn it as part of their ceremonies and that kind of thing. But there's lots and lots of different uses for it. Basket weaving is another one. So I don't want to I don't know all the uses for it, but those are 2 that I do know. And then the Monarda kind of dumbfounded me as well, but I said, okay. And I didn't really push them on that one. So, they just added the Monarda in there. So.
Okay. Have I missed any questions that anyone has put in the chat that they I don't feel like I've missed any questions.
Ashley, there is one question, I believe for Minnesota DOT. Do you see that one?
Let's see.
Don't. No, I don't see that one.
Okay.
Oh.
So this was from Mark. You guys see that question about, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced the name.
Do you
of
want me
the
to take that
tribe.
one?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay. Do the maps include the Chippewa National Forest lands that were transferred in a Coordination Act of 2020? Levi,
This
did you take that one?
Yeah, I can take that question because it's my homelands. So the reservation border you see that's there, kind of looks like an angry Pac-Man. That's my homelands. All lands within that border are Indian country. The difference is how they're titled. So those lands that came back in the Restoration Act, those lands will just go from federal title under U.S. Department of Agriculture to United States Department of Interior. Still titled, still have the owner listed as United States federal government. Hope that answers that question. And all those lands, all those national forest lands, my tribe, we have exclusive rights and privileges to hunt, fish, and gather. The state of Minnesota pays for the right and privilege to hunt and fish on the Leech Lake Reservation for our hunting and fishing. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. Let me scroll down and see if I've missed any others. There's a link in there to the Highway 20 feasibility study. Haga, I think we're pretty close on time. I don't know if there's a final wrap up or give anyone one last chance. Okay, there is a final wrap up slide. So Haga, I'll let you sign us off.
Yes, thank you for leading that, Ashley, and thank you again to our presenters. If you do have any further questions, please feel free to chat us or send an email and we'll forward your questions to the presenters. And yes, thank you all again for joining us today. Following this, you'll see a little pop-up box come up and that will take you to our post-attendee survey. We'd love to hear your thoughts and comments on how we can improve our webinars and also hear about what topics you'd be interested in hearing about in the future. So just to give you a bit of a teaser, we're looking at potentially hosting a webinar on invasive species management and also on public perception, communicating with landowners and educating regulators. So thank you again for joining us today. Thank you again to all our speakers. And if you have any thoughts or questions, please feel free to reach out to us and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to the speakers. Have a great afternoon, everyone.